Hello, and welcome back to another one of my ranking episodes. This time around, we're going to be looking at all of the F2 drivers of the 2022 season, and to be specific, because there were 29 drivers, I'm actually going to only be ranking those who completed at least 4 rounds, so that is 24 drivers. I did use an algorithm to calculate for all 29 of them to kind of spread the field a little bit, similar to how I used all of those doing the FP1 sessions in F1. But yeah, I kind of had the same style, although I had to divide my statistics a little bit differently since it's a spec series and I want to evaluate everyone as individuals rather than within their teams. So, let's go along how I categorize everyone at the end. I have my championship contenders are now along the lines of they deserve promotion, or a great season is like they could advance to F1 with the right academy conditions, or other pay drivers such as we saw with Mazepin a few years ago. In the 8 to 5 caliber, we have solid midfield, where whether they're advancing or it's a driver who's been there for years, it does help to have them in the field because they're kind of good at setting a benchmark for the field. In my mid to low end category, I have the drivers that need to either improve next season to stay within F2, or if they're entering like their 3rd, 4th, 5th seasons, it's one of those where it's just like, why are they still here? And simply if they're not in the, or simply if they are in the 20 plus category, they just don't have a future in single seaters. I know that's mean, and it's weird saying this about kids who are so young, but whether it's in F1, IndyCar, or Formula E, I think they just need to look towards maybe GT cars, endurance, or something that's just not the single seaters. They might not have a future there. Of course, these numbers, similar to my F1 rankings, are not talking about the ranks themselves, but rather the numbers that I generate in these little red boxes that I now have outlined. So I'm talking about. So let's go over how I generate those numbers. So I'm talking about average qualifying positions, feature race positions, sprint races, and combined positions between those two. Obviously, the feature race is valued more importantly, and I'll combine their average qualifying positions with their average race and all of that, etc., etc. After that, I'll look at the points too that they scored, and for those drivers that weren't in every single round, because there were some who were not in every round, I will also base it on a per round basis to potentially give them more or less value, depending on what they did, because a guy who got 20 points in 14 rounds obviously isn't as good as the guy who did it in like 4 rounds, for example. Now, in the essence of fairness, I did have to account for DNFs and etc., but if a driver did crash themselves out or was deemed at fault, they were heavily penalized compared to if they had an incident that wasn't their fault at all or had to DNF due to some sort of mechanical reliability issues. Then it's not really the driver's fault at all, so I can't really take that into account. So I would just toss that away and not really measure it, although I guess I would. So to do that, I would calculate between race pace and qualifying pace of a session where the driver didn't have whatever luck. So yeah, I'd use their dry sessions compared to their teammates at that point or a comparable rival to find an estimated time for every session kind of thing, figure out who was fastest where. Okay, so let's start down in P24. I have Tatiana Calderon. All of these early drivers, I'm probably going to go through everyone pretty quick unless I feel like I can talk about them in length. It's probably going to go pretty quickly for some of them. Okay, so starting with P24, I have Tatiana Calderon. And in the 4 rounds that she was part of the field, she was simply the worst driver in the field pretty much for all of those rounds. So it was pretty easy to rank her at the back, considering I think she was the only driver I had whose average qualifying and finishing position was above 20 in all categories. I'm unsure why coming back to F2 after losing her IndyCar sponsors seemed like the right idea. Moving on. Oh yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think I said it, I came up with all of their rankings based on data. I didn't just slot them where I wanted to. This was all purely by numbers. So yeah, moving on. In P23, I put Cam Pogbasi. I know he had a lot of hype before the start of the season, especially from the Turkish crowd, constantly spamming the social media pages with the flag and everything. And the fact that he was also an esports driver was awesome. But he just simply did not have the performance to really do anything. His entire strategy seemed like it was to qualify at or near the back, and he would just benefit from other cars having issues, which might be great for F1 leagues and open lobbies and such like that, but it just didn't really actually make up for anything himself in real F2. So, in P22, I have Ollie Caldwell. He's one of a few drivers within this list that I don't think should have been in F2 this year to begin with. I think he needed another year in Formula 3, and it was a bit eager of him to jump into this category this season. I don't know if it was if it was his team pushing for F2, or if the Ferrari Driver Academy, which I can't actually remember if he's still part of during the season. But either way, I think this was just too early for him to be jumping into F2, and I have him currently pretty low in the rankings. I won't be shocked if he gets another year to at least try and improve, maybe if he gets on a different team or something like that. But right now, he's kind of a big red flag for me. In P21, I've got Amaury Cordial. He finished the season off very strong, I gotta give that to him. But before that, especially at the beginning of the season, he was showing absolutely no promise. My mind goes straight to, I think it was Jeddah, where he crashed himself out and he ruined his car for basically the entire weekend. And so that heavily penalized him, for example, because he crashed himself out. And, well, usually when it was his own fault, I think. I don't remember if there was anything else to it. And yeah, there's just nowhere to go but up, it really seems, for him. And I know he's doing another year, and I won't be shocked if it's similar to what happened with Sato with Virtuosi, but I don't know if this guy has a future in single-seaters, basically. Moving on to the guy I just mentioned in, whoa, that was a little glitchy, in P20, I have Marino Sato. At the beginning of the season, I know through social media, I was very, very vocal on why would Virtuosi pick this guy for their second seat for any reason other than money, and he seemed to prove that throughout the year. He had the odd decent performance here and there, but overall he was just consistently a backmarker. Moving on. In P19, I put Callan Williams. This was another one of those drivers who I felt should not be jumping up to F2 this season, considering he was mid-pack, if not closer to the back, I think even in F3 last year. But he did do the job every now and then, and he did pull him a good performance, scored a few points in Jeddah, but he's going to need to improve, or he's going to be forever just known as a guy with money that happened to be racing in F2. Bringing up, I have in P18 the legend himself, Roy Nissany of the Williams Driver Academy. He had a few amazing qualifying sessions this year, but no matter what, in almost every race, it seems he just seemed to fall back, and sometimes had incidents, completely, what was the word I'm looking for? There was no reason for him to just crash. He would just take himself out. His pace is there. He just really needs to improve himself with his race performance and consistency. I believe at this point he's signed to come back for another year, and even though he is, I don't know how many seasons he's done. I want to say this was his third, but at least he's working right now as a decent benchmark for a lot of drivers as simply what you need to beat. So I can't say he's been embarrassing himself by any means, but yeah, moving on. In P17, I put Clement Novalak, a driver who I felt was actually great in F3 and deserved promotion. But now looking at the results, maybe he should have done another year in F3. He did every now and then have himself a great performance, but his issue seemed to be, like many other drivers in the field, consistency and being able to qualify well and then move up regularly. It seemed like whenever he would have one great race and weekend, the other would just always have issues. It was just never there for both races. So in P16, I put a fill-in driver of David Beckman. It seems like whenever he came in, he was just not really a bad driver, or saying that he even really had great performance here and there, but he just kind of worked and fit right in the middle. Maybe if he was on a different team, he could have done better, but he had himself a solid drive. And moving on. In P15, I put Ralph Boschung. He actually had an amazing start to the season, but of course he had all of those injury issues dealt with, and when he came back, he was just not on the same pace that he left off with. I know he's done quite a few seasons, and he's coming back for another one, I believe. I like him as a driver. He's similar to Nissany. He's just a solid benchmark for a lot of drivers right now, especially considering when he is on his day, he's going to put up a great performance. In P14, I put Jake Hughes. He's supposed to be getting his first full-time chance at an F2 drive. Granted, I'm saying that he didn't stick around for the full season, but I felt he had a decent season for what he did. It wasn't really bad, wasn't really good. It was just similar to Beckman, right down the middle. Every now and then was able to score points and was almost at least contending for points. Like, if he wasn't in a points position, he seemed to be hovering in that 11 to 15 spot. And I'd like to have seen him get another year, but or at least even finish this season. But yeah, he's off to Formula E next year, I think with McLaren, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, moving on. So P13, I now have Enzo Fittipaldi, the little shark. And I would say he continually got better as the season was going on. But like many others, he still had some inconsistencies here and there. And for a guy who I didn't think he had done enough to earn an F2 spot this season, he was really so much better than I expected. He even earned himself a spot with Red Bull. I don't know if he has what it takes to continue that sort of huge progression that he's been making, but I'm very excited to see what he can pull off next year in Carlin. In P12, I have Frederik Vesti. Now, unlike a lot of other drivers who I felt shouldn't have been in F2 this year, Vesti was kind of the opposite. He was a guy who I felt could have been in F2 a year earlier. So I had a lot of high expectations of him, but he just didn't really hit them. He still had himself a good season, win 5 podiums, but he has a long way to improve if he wants to potentially earn himself a look further into the Mercedes Academy, where expectations are usually nothing but championship levels, basically. On to the next. In P11, I put Dennis Hauger. Arguably had the biggest expectations on him going into the season after dominating F3 last year and taking the seat of the guy who dominated F2 the year before. There's a lot of expectations for him to compete for a championship potentially within his rookie year. And even I was among those who thought he'd at least be competitive. I didn't have him as a pick to win the championship. I felt like that was a little too eager, but I thought he'd at least be a little more up there. So to say he was underwhelming should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because I think he kind of did what's expected of a rookie overall, and he had himself 2 wins, which can't be overlooked, and one of them was in Monaco, and he had 2 other podiums to go along with that. So yeah, he had himself a good season, I think, but right now, if Red Bull is looking to potentially put someone into an AlphaTauri seat for 2024, he's going to have to make some big-time improvements. In P10, I have Juri Vips, who I think easily can be said as one of the fastest drivers in the field, with one of the most disappointing seasons both on and off the track. I won't speak at all on the issues as to what happened off the track because it's irrelevant to his performance, but he always seemed to have an absolutely great performance here and there, and there was multiple wins that he just completely threw away by crashing out. I think, of course, I think it was Imola and Baku, where he was leading races and just crashed. So I don't think he's going to be back next year based on the off-track stuff, but there's just so much potential there, and he can probably maybe show that in another category. In P9, I have Richard Verschoor, who is just always the driver seemed to be right around the back end of the top 10, scoring points. And every now and then he had himself a great performance, but the ultimate best thing about him was that he just never really seemed to have a bad performance, and he was always just right there, always in the fight. Similar to that, in P8, I have Marcus Armstrong, who I would say very, very quietly, he had himself a really good season. I mean, 3 wins and another podium to go along with it is absolutely nothing to be laughed at. Yeah, like I said, he was very similar to Verschoor, where it was just more or less he just did not have a bad performance. But it seemed that he was always there with the rest of the crowd at the front, and was just always one who could not be underestimated. And I'm actually really looking forward to seeing him in IndyCar next year. In P7, I have Jehan Daruvala. Now, he had a lot of expectations of him going into this year. He was probably kind of hoping to do what Guan Yu Zhou did in getting a title, or at least be in title contention in his 3rd season, especially when going into a team like Prema, but he just did not have a good year. Yeah, he got a win in Monza and a lot of other podiums actually to go along with it, but for what was expected of him being a veteran and arguably the strongest team in the junior categories, this was just a very disappointing season. And I don't think he currently has a seat for next year, but if it was up to me in Helmut Marko's position, I'd be looking to move him out in a completely different path right now. I don't think he has what it takes to move up to F1 at this point, at least not in a full-time seat. Maybe he'll get a reserve or test role, maybe get an FP1 session or something like that, but I can't see him moving up to F1 at this point now. In P6, I've got Ayumu Iwasa, who for me was easily the biggest shock of the year. Like, preseason, I was questioning, why is this guy advancing to F2? He didn't have a good season at F3, and he absolutely proved me wrong. Yeah, I had well, at first he proved me very right, in that he crashed in the Bahrain qualifying, I think it was, before even putting in a lap on just his outlap. But everything since then he's shown has just been one of the fastest guys in the field. He's always cutting through. Yeah. If he seems to have the right team around him, I'm guessing, compared to, I think he might have been with Genzer in F3, I'm very much looking forward to seeing what he could do in a 2nd season, as I think he's one of the contenders for a potential seat in AlphaTauri in 2024. Because I know they just brought in De Vries and Yuki's there, but I think they're going to at least have one driver change in 2024 in AlphaTauri. Moving on, in P5, I have the driver who I actually picked to win the championship before the start of the season. Granted, I don't have that on record or anything, but to me, especially seeing him switch to a team like Carlin, I thought Liam Lawson had the best chance to win this championship, and early on it looked like he was going to contend for that. But some poor luck through the season, some DNFs that weren't his fault, and then just other inconsistencies where he seemed to either be right at the top or just lagging behind ever so slightly, but he's a very fast driver. I was hoping he would get a 3rd season to prove himself, but it looks like that might not be the case. I think he's going to Super Formula, the Pierre Gasly route, and jump potentially maybe into an F role out of there. But yeah, Super Formula isn't a series I follow, but out of curiosity, I'm probably going to be keeping track of him and his results every now and then. Moving on, in P4, I have what will come off as kind of a big shock in Theo Pourchaire, but he just did not have as good of a season as what was expected of him. I know amongst many he was the preseason favorite to potentially win the championship this year, so to see him as inconsistent as he was, granted, well, not inconsistent in the sense of what many's were, like when you're expected to be battling for wins and you're just mid-level of the points, it was inconsistent for him, basically. And yeah, granted, he also did have some bad luck to go along with that. I'm looking especially at rounds like Monza, and but it was just tough to justify him being higher or having a better season than those who I do have above him. As much as he did still have a great season, especially with 3 wins, 7 podiums. I could easily still have seen him even being in F1 next year to take that second Alfa Romeo seat if things didn't work out with Zhou. In P3, I put Jack Doohan. Well, I won't say it was a big shock considering in the first 2 rounds that he did at the end of 2021, he also excelled, but this kid is just so freaking fast. It's awesome to watch, and I think he's absolutely going to get into F1 at some point, whether it's full-time or I think he's actually going to be a reserve for Alpine, like, even this very next season. But yeah, I really hope he gets another year in F2 before that and doesn't get rushed in. If that hasn't already been confirmed, as I think he will probably be the championship favorite for next year, even if Pourchaire is still there. Yeah, he's just so fast, but just needs to get that little bit of consistency and a little bit of patience behind him. With that said, he actually reminds me a bit of Verstappen-like in that he's just so freaking fast, but needs to tone down the aggression a little bit, avoid some of the incidents that he was in, and he'd be able to make those overtakes he wants to do. He just needs to pick his spots better. And in P2, I put Logan Sargeant. Now, I will say that I thought he wouldn't be this good, but at the same time, I won't say it's a shock that he did this as well as he has, because he should have been in F2 in 2021. And the year before, based on his performance, was absolutely spectacular in F3, and his F2 career was similar. He just always did what he needed to do and was awesome. And similar to Doohan, he has the pace, but just needs to get a little bit better out of avoiding the incidents. Like, yes, he had 2 wins, but only 4 podiums, which is a lot less than some of those who are below him in these rankings, but I think he got 2 or 3 pole positions. And outside of that, he was always in the battle for top spots, and that's why I'm just not shocked at all that Williams decided to promote him, as much as I think it's maybe just a little bit early for him. I don't think it was a bad choice to promote him. I don't know if there was anyone really outstandingly better to step into that seat, maybe out of like a Daniel Ricciardo or looking at someone like Joseph Newgarden from IndyCar, but those were just never going to happen. So finally, in P1, it's absolutely no shock that I have Felipe Drugovich. He was just absolutely consistent and near the top of every category throughout the season. Now, at the start of the season, I definitely would not have put him as a favorite, but to see him excel, have the great season that he did, doesn't really shock me too much. The thing that shocks me is the fact that it came with MP Motorsport. Like, I thought that was when he went to UNI Virtuosi last year. I thought that was when he was going to really jump up the charts, and considering his first rookie season with MP was awesome. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what happens with him in his future. Maybe you can get a seat in the future similar to Nick DeVries, because it's obvious he has the pace, but he just doesn't really have the backing or the pathway to find a way to F1 at this moment, as much as he potentially deserves to be there in what was one of the more F2 seasons so far. So now that I've got every driver in the rankings and we can see the data points that I've put next to them, let's see where I fit them within their tiers, as I believe this next slide will do. So yeah, Drugovich was the only championship contender, probably deserves promotion, which he kind of is getting with his reserve role at Aston. And yeah, so I've got Sargeant, Doohan, Pourchaire, Lawson, and Iwasa, who all had great seasons too. If the cards were right and within their respective academies and teams were looking for drivers, or if they had the right money backing potentially, I could have easily seen any of those 5 drivers going into F1 next year. Now I've got the midfield pack of Daruvala, Armstrong, Verschoor, Vips, Hauger, Vesti, Fittipaldi, Hughes, and Balshan. Big midfield. Well, they just had good seasons, simply put. not anything to scoff at, but just will definitely need to either improve, or I think some of them aren't in the field next year anyways. But they were just great benchmarks to have and to separate the great drivers from the pack, and to see those who were just simply underwhelming. In my mid to bottom category, I had Beckman, Novalak, Nissany, Williams, and Sato, who I believe all of them just really need to improve in the case of, let's see, I think you have Novalak and Williams, but at this point I think Beckman, Nissany, and Sato are now entering their third year longer, so I just really don't know why they're still trying when it's very clear that they're not going to get a look at F1 in the future at this point. I think they're just throwing away their money right now. And in my bottom category of drivers, there's Cordeal, Caldwell, Bolekbasi, and Calderon. I know it's really mean to say, but at least 3 of these drivers, because I think they were all in their rookie seasons especially, but if they're performing this low, especially when there are other rookies in the field just as inexperienced and they all excelled, it's very clear at this point that they just likely do not have a future in single-seaters, in my opinion. Granted, I think at least in the case of some of them that they never should have been in F2 to begin with, at least for this year. So, yeah, I feel bad about that. But data is data. So with all of that said, I know there's probably some contentious points that I have here, and I would love to hear others' opinions as to why they should move up or down, or yeah. Granted, all of my numbers generated here is completely data-driven. I could easily argue, for example, like how is Armstrong above Vips, who's way faster? How is Pourchaire so low when he was clearly such a favorite to potentially even come back late in the championship? But numbers don't lie, and that's how I came up with these rankings. And I would still absolutely love to hear others' opinions and tell me where I'm wrong, where I'm right. And thank you very, very, very much for watching.